Welcome to Neurology Grand Rounds. Today I have the unique pleasure of introducing the Warren and Germaine Magnuson Chair, Professor and Chair of Neurology, Bruce Ransom. Being familiar with Professor Ransom, my father, it's tempting to share some stories like about his mustachioed 1970s fashion sense, or how he used to get the neighborhood kids to wash his orange Fiat convertible in exchange for rides around the block. It's kind of a Tom Sawyer fence painting operation. But I'll try to focus on his many professional achievements. So Bruce grew up in Osseo, Minnesota, and studied psychology at the University of Minnesota before moving to St. Louis for medical school. And there, despite the challenges of a growing family, he completed his MD PhD in record time. He worked with Sid Goldring and published some very influential and technically challenging studies, making in vivo intracellular recordings from glial cells and cat cortex, what they called silent cells. And that really fueled his lifelong passion for all things glia. That's really defined his career. After finishing medical school, he went to the NIH, where he worked with a group that pioneered the use of cell culture of mammalian neurons. And he published several classic electrophysiology studies, including some that established postsynaptic GABA A receptors as a site of action for pentobarbital. He then went to Stanford for residency and then joined the faculty there. At that time, he really refocused his scientific efforts on glial cells, efforts that continued later as a professor at Yale, and since coming to the University of Washington in 1995. He's published extensively on brain extracellular space, ionic and pH homeostasis, brain energy metabolism, gap junction communication, and the anoxic and the pathophysiology of anoxic and ischemic injury in CNS white matter. I don't think we can overlook one of his biggest accomplishments as a crusader of glia was setting up the journal Glia. He's been a tireless promoter of glial cells, and while he was still at Stanford, he and his colleague Helmut Kettenmann set about trying to create a journal dedicated to glial research. There wasn't a lot of interest in glia at the time, and a prominent neuroscientist famously said, "Why do you need a journal dedicated to glia? We'll know everything we need to know in 10 years." But they had the vision to persist, and they launched their journal in 1988. Since that time, there's been a real explosion of interest in research on glia. We now know that they're not simple nerve glue, but partner cells involved in the pathophysiology and physiology of essentially every brain process. And along the way, he developed an interest in movement disorders, which is a topic he's going to tell us about today.
That was almost embarrassing, Chris. And for a moment, I was a little tired, and I thought, maybe Chris has two fathers, this really accomplished person that he's talking about. So this is a lecture that I've actually given before, and I approached the notion of giving it again with a certain amount of trepidation, but I gave it 6.5 years ago, and I think the statute of limitations has run. I always wanted to say that, but I think that's probably the case. I know there's a lot of new faces in this room that weren't here when I last spoke on this topic in July of 2010. I'm going to talk about serendipity, discovery, and neurology. One of the most important lessons for anybody who is a clinician, who is a scientist, is to recognize that a lot of your inspiration, a lot of your best ideas come from accidents. And you have to have the tenacity, you have to have the capacity to recognize the ones that are really worth pursuing, and the tenacity to stay with them, even if there are a lot of roadblocks to getting to the real point of it. And the upshot of all of this is that you're going to have all kinds of opportunities in your professional careers, whether they're scientific or clinical, where something is going to happen. It's going to be a smack in front of you. And if you were to recognize it, and if you were to commit to fully exploring it, it would probably turn out to be interesting and important. But you're going to miss a lot of those. So you don't need to get them all, but you need to get some of them. And that's the lesson. So my conclusion has already been provided by Louis Pasteur. Did you ever observe to whom the accidents happen chance favors the prepared mind. And if I were going to try to design something that represented a conclusion, it would be close to this. So I want to set the stage for the story that I'm going to tell you, which is about some serendipity and some very interesting developments. To do that, I'm going to use a couple of photographs from that period. This is early 80s, probably 81, 82, 83. This is the Stanford Department of Neurology back in that particular period of time. And I think I've taken the liberty of putting a red circle around a couple of people that might be recognizable, Rusty Novotny and myself. We had a very illustrious department. I've bothered to put a couple of names on this picture to identify some people that I think have had a huge impact in neurology and in science. There's a period thing going on here, and these yellow areas point to some very important features of the dress code. Baggy? Are you kidding me? We're talking massive baggy. We're talking cuffs and leggings that you could probably fly if you got thrown out of a plane at 30,000 feet. The tie width, well, there's a variety of different tie widths, but wide was good. Wide was good, and wider was even better. And it was a time when mustaches were quite in vogue. I think we have 3 in a row here, but you'll see there's a lot of facial hair. I had one as well. So this is 1982. I'm dressed in a period costume here in my preparation to see patients. We had an intramural softball team, and we were doggone good. It was co-ed. We were called the Myoclonic Jerks. Many people simply called us the Jerks, which we sort of appreciated. There's some pretty impressive people in this particular photograph, and I'm only going to point out a couple. Behind me is Scott Thompson, who's a very well-established and well-known and a major scientific contributor. Dave McCormick, the same way. Barry Connors, enormously influential. And Chris, help me out here. This is the guy who worked with Saucklin and Nair, Owen Hamill, who really invented the panch clamp recording technique. Now I've got one more little prep slide, and this prep slide is a picture, and I struggled with whether this was just too risque for a Grand Rounds audience. We're on a trip. Cache Creek is a little stream not too far from Stanford, and about once a year, I guess I was sort of responsible for getting everybody together. We go on a rafting trip. There's someone in this picture who will grow up to be a fine young neurologist. And the question is, can you identify that individual? We'll give you another go at the end of the lecture on that particular question. So let me start my story. This setting, remember, is the early 80s, actually to be very precise, summer of 1982. And I'm going to tell you the story about Toby Govia. I'm going to talk about a lot of patients' names, because all of these patients have given full consent to have their names, pictures, any information that a doctor should see fit to talk about, to have all that information provided to medical audiences. So Toby Govia was an interesting guy, and he was emblematic of what it was like to be in a working class family in the southern part of Northern California around Salinas. He happened to live in Watsonville, and I think that was one of the it's a very famous for growing vegetables. I was trying to remember what it's known as. The Garlic Festival. That's what I'm searching for. Okay. All right. So we got a lot of California expertise in the audience. Maybe. All right. That's it. So that's where he lived. He was in his mid to late 20s. I can't remember his exact age. And Toby belonged to a family that had brothers, sisters, father and mother. There was even a couple of uncles. They lived in a little row of houses. They intermittently worked. But frankly, Toby's job application in terms of prior experience would have said peddling drugs, petty theft, and car break-ins, because those were the things that he was really good at. On a Saturday night, his family would gather around the kitchen table and they would pick a drug, PCP, cocaine, heroin, something, and they would all get high on this particular drug. And this was not terribly uncommon. Not very smart, but not terribly uncommon. On a particular night in the early summer, either late May or the very first days of June in 1982, Toby was feeling really good because he had gotten a new batch of heroin. He'd gotten it at a steal price, and he'd sold a lot of it to a lot of individuals, and he offered it to his family, but actually he didn't really give it to anybody except himself. They all used the old stuff, but he felt that this new stuff was terrific. He shot up with it. He felt a very unusual burning sensation in his veins, but then had a glorious high. And over the next several days, he did this repeatedly until he began to discover that he could barely get out of bed and that he was developing a tremor. But he was able to go about his important business activities as a petty drug dealer. And he went to a corner and was distributing drugs. He was no longer very clandestine because he had a classic resting Parkinsonian tremor and didn't move very fast. And a policeman approached him, and normally, as I understand the story, Toby would have scooted away and jumped a couple of fences, and the policeman would have said, forget about it. But he could barely move. He wound up in custody. He was put in jail. And there his stiffness worsened and worsened and worsened. And finally, Toby got to a point where he was no longer taking even fluids. He was not making any verbal commentary whatsoever. His eyes still appeared to be very much alive, but he was stiff as a board except for this tremor. They called a psychiatrist because the jailers thought this is another petty criminal trying to pass themselves off as having had some sort of a condition or a illness of some sort. And the psychiatrist came and said, this could be something serious, but gosh, this guy's not eaten for 2 days. It could be 3 now. I think we should try something. I think it could be a form of schizophrenia. And the psychiatrist gave him a whopping dose of Prolixin. That did not help Toby. He became stiffer. Whatever little bit of fluid was getting in before that particular moment was no longer getting in. He was shipped to Stanford, and we admitted him to the neurology service. Rusty reminded me, where's Rusty? There's Rusty, that he and another resident, a co-resident of his, Tom Gordon, were involved in Toby's care during that fateful hospitalization in June of 1982. When they brought me by as the new attending to see all the patients, and I got to Toby's bedside, I literally couldn't believe my eyes. This was a 20-ish-year-old man whose history said that he was running around being a petty criminal 2 weeks ago, and now he looked like the absolute worst case of Parkinson's disease I'd ever seen. You've seen resting tremor, but you will rarely see someone whose tremor includes virtually every part of their body, including the tongue. Toby wasn't taking any fluids, certainly any solid food. They'd started an IV. They were giving him some parenteral nutrition, and there was no diagnosis. On examination, the single thing that she left the bedside thinking about was that Toby looked completely alert. He looked in distress and alert. So we proceeded to get him out of the jail, get him into the medical center, but we didn't really have much to offer him. It was so obvious that these symptoms were Parkinsonism that we started with some anticholinergics, reasonable enough, nothing happened. And then finally I said we should try some levodopa, or maybe Rusty said that. Somebody said it, and we did exactly that, and suddenly this guy was much, much, much better. And we'll talk more about that in just a moment. Now, what I've told you so far is a single far-fetched medical incident, and for our money, the history of the Prolixin injection was enough to put this into the category of a neuroleptic-induced severe, almost fatal Parkinsonian condition. What more was going on? When Toby got jailed, his girlfriend, Connie Saints, became very distressed. And according to Toby, he had strictly forbade her to use any of the heroin. But she found it, and she began to fix on a daily basis with that heroin. She did that for a week and lapsed into a state of tremendous rigidity. There was no tremor whatsoever, but she wasn't moving at all. Her sister came over, moved her over to their house, started providing care. They were worried that she'd done something illegal and that this was some kind of weird drug reaction, so they kept their mouths shut until it was just too much. And they brought her to Stanford, where she was admitted to the psychiatry department. The neurology team was asked to come by and consult on this lady with probable catatonic schizophrenia. And when I examined her, she had tremendous waxy flexibility, this characteristic feature where you hold the arms up and they stay like that for quite some time before finally coming down. I could see that they had worked her over pretty carefully, examining everything, searching for a Babinski sign, and in her eyes was a tremendous amount of fear, and it looked to me like a lot of pain. She wasn't speaking, she wasn't communicating in any way. Finally, in the absence of a tremor and more characteristic features of Parkinson's disease, we concurred with the psychiatrist that this was probably catatonic schizophrenia, and we left her to their care.
Did you know that she was?
Yes, we knew that. But she'd given a very blunted history about any drug usage. So this was another thing that was a bit fuzzy at this point. When the psychiatrist sent her home, they had a long talk with she and her sister. And her sister is on record with these quotations saying, she's going to be fine. This problem is all in her head. And indeed, it absolutely was. So I made some phone calls after we finally discharged Toby to some sort of a rehabilitation facility on levodopa. And I got a hold of the Salinas Police Department that had arrested Toby and knew a lot about him. They said, oh yes, we know Toby well. And I said, do you have any of the stuff he was using before he got jailed most recently? And they said, well, as a matter of fact, we have several bindles of that exact material. They're evidence, but we have several, so, if you needed some, it wouldn't be a problem. And at that point, I thought, this is Palo Alto, California. It's 1982. Drug trade is just rampaging down the road. Everyone is making a nickel, including people that have mass spec machinery and a lot of chemical expertise. They were measuring unmarked samples that you dropped at a window, and then you'd come back in a couple of days when no one was around and get a report after paying a sum of money about what percentage of your particular sample was cocaine or PCP or heroin or whatever. So I thought, I'll call these guys. And I called them up, and they said, sure, we can make some measurements. I thought, well, this is interesting. But they said it's expensive. And they said, we're not making any kind of medical allowance for this thing you want to do. So I immediately went and talked to our chairman, David Prince. And I think I got through my first sentence, and David got this very weary, exasperated expression on his face, and he said, are you kidding me? Really? No way. Forget about it.
That's what chairman always said.
Yeah. I got to be careful here, because someone may actually have some recorded footage of me saying something like that. Okay, so now I want to introduce a new player in this little saga that I'm talking to you about, and that is Bill Langston. Bill was an assistant professor towards the end of his 6 years as an assistant professor at Stanford, so he was up for tenure. And Bill was very well known by the residents because he was an exceptionally detailed neurologist. His real interest was neuro-ophthalmology. He had done a fellowship with Bill Hoyt, who published the book on neuro-ophthalmology, and Bill could always be counted on to pull out a couple of gizmos to examine the visual fields or eye movements or something like that. But he wound up making his practice at Valley Medical Center, which is a county hospital south of Palo Alto by 15 or 20 miles. And all of a sudden, a heroin addict with stiffness showed up on his doorstep, probably 2 to 3 weeks after we had seen the 2 patients I just told you about. Bill also, and Bill plays the major role in the story that we're relating today. Bill had a network of friends. Phil Ballard, who was a fellow with Bill at the time and practiced in this area, and he and Bill talked about this a lot. And Phil said, "I'm going to take the weekend off and go to the beach." And so he went over and hung out with some doctor friends of his. And one of the doctors at a cocktail party said, "Boy, did I see a strange case." And Phil was about to interrupt to tell him about the strange case that they had seen when this guy began to relate that a heroin addict had appeared stiff as a board. So immediately, Phil picked up the phone at 11 o'clock at night and called Bill and said, "We've got an epidemic." And the next day, or it could have been Sunday, they had an emergency press conference. And Bill Langston got in front of the cameras and made it very clear that something strange was happening in the neighborhood, and people should be very careful. The news channels picked it up, and it became a big deal. But frankly, it was a suspicion. There was no proof. There was no evidence whatsoever. I'm going to mention several other names, and I'm just listing them here. The Sylvie brothers, David and Bill, George Carrillo, and Juanita Lopez will figure prominently in just a bit. George Carrillo was this first patient that they took care of. Here's a picture of him quite sick in June or July of 1982, untreated, because the folks down at Valley had given their patients nothing except some anticholinergics. You also see a picture of Connie Saints, and this is a little bit later when she's feeling better and is getting some treatment. During the time when she was completely unable to move, she developed terrible bed sores and a sciatic crush injury. So she'd been in agonizing pain during all of this period of time. Now, I don't need to remind any of you, even if you don't see it very often anymore, that neuroleptics can produce a Parkinsonian syndrome. And in the days of the people with gray hair in this room, they would have seen some very sick individuals, stiff as a board, tremendous tremor. I'd seen 1 or 2 case reports of people sort of resembling Toby Govia, although probably not quite that bad, and none of them had responded much to levodopa. But I thought that's got to be the answer. So in California, in the 80s, when you have a notion like that and a very interesting patient, you make a movie. And that's what I did. So here's that movie, and let's hope that I can play it. Maybe I can. Well, you're hearing this young neurologist talking and describing the examination. There you go. Move it up. Yeah, 3 to 5 per second. So this looks like a patient with Parkinson's disease. Toby's talking now. He's describing.
Neck musculature, I think you can see it in the jaw and also involved to some extent his tongue. The tremor has interfered over the course of this illness significantly with his ability to swallow and speak. Toby, can you tell us how long you've had these symptoms? In addition to the tremor, there are some other quite striking Parkinsonian features. I think it's quite apparent that the patient is not exhibiting the normal repertoire.
So this guy goes on like that for quite some time, but he is essentially examining about the most Parkinsonian person you're ever going to see. And by the way, the name of that movie, and you can still look it up at the Stanford Library if you should so choose, is Drug-Induced Parkinsonism. And now that haunts me because, of course, the drug I was talking about was not a toxin, but a phenothiazine. So just let's loop back and talk about Parkinson's disease just for a moment. James Parkinson, as far as I'm concerned, was a terrific practitioner of the notion of taking advantage of things that are pitched right up into your front yard. So here he is at the age of 62, publishing this magnificent monograph, and I want to know who at least has held that monograph in their hand. Anybody here besides me? I am sure there are others. Phil's probably got a first edition. If you have a first edition of this book, it is now worth, just looked it up, $24,000. So you're well on your way to a new car or, something pleasant, that extended trip to Europe that you've been planning. And he examined a number of patients in the area where he practiced. It's a suburb of London, fundamentally, called Shoreditch. And this apparently comes from some queen or contessa, I guess not a contessa, a queen or a noblewoman who had a little farm in that area. And he watched these people, some of them, and examined a couple of them. And who knows how many patients he looked at to put together what I think almost every authoritative medical historian claims is one of the clearest descriptive pieces of neurology ever written. We have 4. Do I hear 5? Do I hear 5? We have 4 or 5. Do I hear 5? Do I hear 6? It's 6. So the answer is 6. 2 of whom he examined, 3. Another one was an acquaintance, and then 3 of them he just simply watched in the street. So from that, he wrote one of the most brilliant descriptive pieces that's ever been written. He was a brilliant guy. He founded the British Geologic Society. He wrote a 3-volume work on fossils. On fossils, ladies and gentlemen. And boy, does that ever make me happy. I collect petrified wood. He was a pamphleteer. He raged against the ignoble things, acts, and cruelties that were being forced upon the citizenry of this particular period. And he was good at it. He wrote under the false name Old Hubert, but he was always in their face and making trouble in that particular regard. 60 years to the day after he published this particular work, Charcot had an audience and said, from thus forward, I will now only refer to the shaking palsy as Parkinson disease or Parkinson's disease. We've now come to prefer Parkinson's disease. And once that happened, because he was the reigning authority in neurology, the name was forever. So there's no known likeness of this guy. Authorities swear that there's never been a picture of him, but I see this picture all the time, and some authorities claim that this is his son that bore a striking resemblance to him. I guess we're not going to know that. You've heard this many times. It's the opening salvo of his book, and like fine music, it just puts you in a mood to want to read more. Involuntary tremulous motion with lessened muscular power and parts not in action, and even when supported. So he's talking there about this tremor, resting tremor, with a propensity to bend the trunk forwards and to pass from a walking to a running pace, or what does it say, to a running pace. Of course, that's festination. The senses and intellects being uninjured. So we know about all the features of Parkinson's disease. Why didn't he describe the rigidity? Because no one in 1817 and earlier would ever take and move a patient's arm around. The neurologic examination hadn't been invented yet. So it was pretty much observation, maybe putting your ear on the chest wall of a patient, and that was it. Now, there's no way you could overstate the importance of Parkinson's disease. So this is modern epidemiology of a sort. It's one of the most troubling conditions that neurologists treat. It's progressive. We have no way to stop the steady progress of the disease. It's prevalent in older populations where it steadily goes up in frequency until about the age of 85 or 90. So if you make it to 90 without Parkinson's disease, the likelihood you're going to get it is probably significantly less. And most importantly, and this is true even to the present, we don't know the cause of this condition. And at the time, in the early 80s, there was no good animal model, and there was no insight whatsoever about a condition, a virus, a toxin, hereditary whatever, that could produce such focal pathology as was known to occur in Parkinson's disease. Now, there are a lot of little things that happen, and these would have been things that got added much later, such as the tendency for a person's handwriting to deteriorate so that it looks like this. Worse than a doctor's handwriting. This is with treatment, the person gets better. And this leads us to an interesting story about fabricated data. Quite some time ago, a hoax was perpetrated in Germany that left the world gasping. Maybe you'll remember this. Suddenly, out of nowhere, someone produced a cache of notebooks that had been handwritten by the madman Adolf Hitler. These were said to provide insight into the madness of his regime, what he was thinking, his motivations, etc., etc. And there was a clamoring for who gets to publish this and look at it and leak it out in little bits to sell lots of papers, etc., etc. And Der Stern won that bidding contest and paid millions of dollars to own these little pamphlets. It took more than a year for these to be discovered to be completely and absolutely fraudulent. And one of the defining characteristics that put the case completely out of reach was the fact that Hitler had Parkinson's disease, and his handwriting progressively deteriorated. This was very well documented, and it was completely missing from these forgeries. So we know about the pathology, the loss of these pigmented neurons in the substantia nigra. We even came to understand that there's a histopathology, the so-called Lewy body. For the longest time, I thought that Frederick Lewy was a German citizen. It turns out that he's French. And he discovered this histopathology, and this histopathology is something that is very, very characteristic of the disease. So there wasn't anything to do in the days of Parkinson, although he did reluctantly say that maybe, you could try some stuff, but fundamentally, and I just love this, he was very, very cautious. He says, until we're better informed respecting what this disease is, the employment of internal medicines is scarcely warrantable. But it didn't take long before this principle enunciated by Osler came to the fore. The desire to take medicine is perhaps the greatest feature which distinguishes man from animals. Isn't that the truth? And I added, this is not Osler, and the desire to give it. Charcot had Tuesday afternoon clinics that you had to buy tickets to get into. That's how exciting these were. They were like theater. Scalpers hung around and sold the tickets for 3 times what they paid for them. The place was packed. It was sweaty. There was a stage door that Charcot would enter with a great flourish, accompanied by an entourage. It's exactly like when I make rounds in the morning. A great entourage of adoring attendants and junior faculty, et cetera, et cetera. And then he would proceed to mesmerize. I have to be careful with this term because Mesmer was alive and working in Vienna at the time. You are feeling very drowsy, and blah, blah, blah. But he would just enthrall these audiences, and he would see one patient after another and take meticulous histories, which everyone, I don't know how the guy does it, because when I take a careful history, the residents are really getting kind of tired, and I see them leaning down like this. Will this guy ever quit? But not Charcot. They would listen patiently as he took more and more information. What he heard over and over and over again was that even if someone had to come 400, 500 miles over horrible roads on a carriage that broke down 10 times and was jiggling, the whole time in this miserable way, the patients tend to feel better when they finally got to the end of that terrible, jouncey journey. And so, of course, when you hear a story like that, you're going to immediately invent the shaking chair. And here we have the shaking chair, patent pending. It's on a little cam, and you get a family member to turn this. Grandpa with Parkinson's disease sits in that cam and goes up and down, just like in the carriage, with tremendous improvement. Not. So it took a while for us to begin to figure out something about neurochemistry, and then we learned that there's a lot of dopamine down here in the substantia nigra, and important projections into the basal ganglia, putamen, et cetera. This is an old slide. It's not up to date with the direct and indirect pathway, but that's not the point of this slide. It's just to remind us this scientific knowledge was growing about this condition. And now it's time to get back to our story. So it is, after all, the MPTP story. And one time, we have to say it out loud, N-methyl-4-phenyl 1,2,3,6 tetrahydropyridine. Most people that talk about this claim that they save at least 20% in an average lecture by being able to say MPTP rather than N-methyl-4-phenyl, blah, blah. So I'm going to go back 4 years, actually 6 years, before the story of Toby Govia. And I'm taking you back to Washington, D.C., and I'm going to introduce you to Barry Kidston and his family. Barry's family were diplomats. They'd been stationed in India, where his father was some sort of a high-ranking embassy official. And Barry was excited to go to India. It's pretty cool to be in India. He was in a British school, getting his letters, et cetera, et cetera. But in his spare time, Barry, who must have had a wayward gene, was seeking out places to get drugs, and he became very fond of heroin and other opioids. So when they brought him back home, and it hastened their departure from India, Barry was an addict in his young age. So Barry got home. His parents hired expensive psychiatrists. They catered to most of his whims and tried to get him refocused. And Barry maybe started responding. It didn't look like he was spending as much money on drugs. And then he started talking at the dinner table about chemistry, and his parents said, "Are you interested in chemistry?" It turned out he was interested in chemistry. So you can imagine the parents, unbelievably proud, tremendously relieved, taking Barry to, and they had resources. They took him to the best chemical supply house in Washington, D.C., and they filled 10 baskets with all these retorts and Bunsen burners and all this stuff. Barry set up a first-class laboratory in the basement and spent hours down there. His parents were stunned. He wasn't out slumming around, getting in trouble. He was in the basement working away on his chemistry set. So what Barry was doing down in the basement was the Ziering reaction, which had been invented by Ziering in 1947. And by the way, up until a few years ago, Ziering was still alive, and did he ever tell an amazing story about this reaction? So this reaction takes you from some pretty simple things, but it's a hard reaction. You got to pay attention. This is not something that you would have done in high school chemistry or even college chemistry. And you move it through, and you shoot for this compound. This is the reverse methyl ester of demerol. This is a whopper of a narcotic. And if it weren't so doggone much trouble to make, it'd be one we would use clinically. It's powerful as hell in very low dosages. It's got the same characteristics, but it's hard to make. And so Ziering got this compound synthesized, but it, there were tiny infinitesimal contaminants depending on conditions, but no worries. So you might ask, why would Barry go to all the trouble of doing the Ziering reaction? He had money, right? He could have gone out and bought drugs. There was no question that they were around. And then you need to say, how in the heck would a kid with his background know anything about doing this particular reaction? So why did he do this? Because it was a designer drug. That was his goal. And you couldn't get a better picture of the thinking from that period than you get from this Trudeau comic strip panel, where these two drug dealers, very smug and enjoying their status, saying we just removed this molecule and voila, legal as seawater. So if you could make something that was not one of these, illegal compounds for distribution to people without prescriptions, then you were good. You were golden. They couldn't do anything. They tested this. There wasn't anything you could do. And as to how you would learn to do that, Yankee ingenuity. There was plenty of places to go to get really detailed information, including what you're going to need to try the Ziering reaction. Although we don't recommend it, it's awfully hard. You've got to be dedicated. All right, so back to Barry, down in the basement doing his chemistry, and the whole time shooting up with MPPP, and very happy, very content, staying home, a real, I'm sure at cocktail parties, a lot of bragging about my son, the chemist. And then one day, something happened. Barry came up and said, I don't feel good. And then he felt even less well, and over. Retrospectively, it's pretty clear that one day he was very impatient because this is a slow reaction. You need to move it along very slowly. He accelerated it with heat, and he got molar contamination of this end product with MPTP. We don't know any of that now, but I'm giving you some advanced insight. So he just became stiff as a board. His parents are connected. They went to the NIH. They were examined by all kinds of fancy neurologists at the NIH. And the NIH folks said, tell us everything. They went down in his basement. They scoured his laboratory stuff. They put off all the chemicals they could find and analyzed them. And they came away saying, we don't know. They took some of the chemicals and they gave them to animals, to rodents. Nothing happened. And finally they said, we don't know. Maybe it's something, because it sure is weird. How could he have gone at age 23 from normal to being Parkinsonian in that short period of time? Anyway, they said, try this levodopa stuff, which he did. He was much, much better. So then, unfortunately, as Barry got worse and worse and dreaded going to see his doctors, he sat under a tree on the NIH campus and took an overdose of cocaine and died. It was a coroner's case. He was on federal property. So there wasn't any discussion about whether you're going to do an autopsy or examine the brain. It was, yes, we're going to do those things. When they examined his brain, he had changes in his midbrain that are exactly what we see with patients that have Parkinson's disease. Alicia Forno at Stanford, a world expert on the histopathology of Parkinson's disease, even found a Levy body. So suddenly a 23-year-old kid has histopathologically demonstrated Parkinson's disease, and the only thing that's curious about the story is that he's 23 and he got this almost overnight. So again, after his death, they went back in, they tore his lab apart. They decided that they would make a comprehensive list of every contaminant they could find, and it included some interesting compounds, including MPTP. But none of them really jumped out. They tried different combinations, never MPTP, giving it to rodents, but no hit. But finally they said, this is just too obvious for us to ignore. And they wrote a paper. The paper had 7 authors. They sent it to the New England Journal of Medicine, hoping against hope that maybe they would take it as a short case report. New England Journal of Medicine sent it back. They sent it to JAMA. And JAMA said, somebody read it and said, wow, that's interesting. You're serious people. We'll publish it. But you have 7 authors, and we have a new rule about articles that are short. It must be 6 authors. So you can imagine the discussion they had later that day. The paper's almost accepted at a world-class journal. Who's going to step away from authorship? I'm sure there were all kinds of volunteers, but finally, no one was going to do this. No one was going to do it, and no amount of talking was going to make it happen. So they wound up publishing this in an absolutely ridiculously obscure brand new journal, the Journal of Psychiatric Pathogenesis or something. It was edited by one of the authors, Irvin Copen. Irvin was a big shot at the NIH, and he said, I think that's where we're going to publish it. So the very first issue of this obscure brand new journal contained this case report. And gosh, everyone talked about it. No, are you kidding? People wrapped dead fish in this and threw it away. And, I don't think anyone had a clue that anything like this had ever happened. It was essentially a Dead Sea Scroll, and I mean completely off the visible wavelengths of light. Okay, so Langston, back to Langston. He's now got a total of 6 patients that he's had real serious involvement with. He's been on the airwaves. He's pretty much milked this as much as he can. The place that he's working is disgusted with him because he's always on the newscast, getting his hair just right. He's a good-looking guy and, drooping a little bit. And Rusty knows him well enough to know that this was not an alien state of affairs for Bill. He just loved it. Get the light. Don't get the rest. Get back. Get resonance. Go over there. So he was dead center in the middle of this white hot spotlight, talking and talking. All the while, Stanford was denying him tenure and proceeding to fire him. So that was happening in the background. He was on his 3rd or 4th marriage, I forget which, and his new wife was pregnant. So he writes about all these things, and I'm not telling them to you to darken his character. I admire the hell out of Bill Langston, but it's just to say that in spite of an enormous number of surround issues that should have distracted him from anything, he was still paying attention. So Langston was still trying to figure out what was going on. He found somebody at the Stanford labs who was really good at mass spec. They broke down a bunch of these samples. They looked at stuff. There were some peaks they couldn't identify against all the catalogs that they could find, but there's very good catalogs. And then he got a break. He'd been talking, as I say, publicly about this, being on the news, et cetera, et cetera. And he got a phone call from somebody that was a forensic pathologist somewhere. And this guy said, he said, I am sure I got a stupid new journal. They were trying to get it out, to different people. And I remember seeing an article about some weird case where a guy shot up with something and got stiff. And I think it could have been like maybe some Parkinsonism or something. And Bill could have been knocked over with a feather. It took him a week to find this journal because it wasn't anywhere. It was in no library. But he finally got the article. You can't just type in the way you would now in PubMed and have it shipped from someplace. And he got it, and he read through it, and then he took it to a spectroscoper, and the spectroscoper said, the biggest peak on here, on the stuff that I'm seeing, fits perfectly with what they were able to identify as MPTP. So they were off to the races. So Bill did something that even I wouldn't try, which is he decided, oh my gosh, this is a really big deal. There are all these cases, in addition to the ones I've talked about, lots of people were acting a bit strangely. Could have been maybe 400 people exposed to this drug. He said, we're going to send it to Science magazine. A history of 6 people that developed symptoms of Parkinson's disease after they had taken heroin. They developed this in a period of less than a week, in the neighborhood of 3 or 4 days, up to about 4 or 5 weeks. We have to get that out there. It could be really important. So Bill sent it to Science, and by gosh, they accepted his paper. And here it is. Here's his Science paper. It's very brief. It was published on February 25th, 1983. This paper has been cited more than 3,200 times, and people guess that it's probably being cited anywhere from 150 to 500 times a year. Still, in fact, it actually has swung up as more people are doing experimenting in animal models. So he really planted a flag. All right, the NIH was meddling this whole time. They were so disgusted that they'd missed this after Bill's paper came out. But once they saw it, they were in a position, because of the resources of the NIH, to do more testing. And they did more testing, and one of them, one day, must have bumped his head really hard because he came in and said, I wonder if maybe rodents don't get this disease. We should try a monkey. And there was a good-sized monkey colony not far away. They injected it, the very first injection, bingo, Parkinson's disease. And pathology to match if you're willing to wait a few weeks while this thing matures. So it looked like a lock, and I would say it is. And here's what we think happens. This is the perfect Trojan horse. So you've got a molecule, MPTP, right here, that's very lipophilic. And in fact, that's the danger, and I'm going to make that point in just a moment as I wrap up. You can breathe this molecule and be contaminated by it. You can rub it on your hands. You can ingest it, of course. But almost, and it very easily sublimates, or whatever that word is, when it goes into a gaseous form. So if you're working close in a closed space, you could breathe it in and be in big trouble. So this stuff is out here. It's harmless in the bloodstream. It's very lipophilic. And guess what? MPTP in your brain, MPTP, nothing else, just MPTP is harmless. You can put huge quantities in the brain, we've discovered after the fact, and nothing happens. The Trojan, that's the Trojan horse part of this, completely safe. Once it gets inside, it interacts with monoamine oxidase B, and it produces a diabolical molecule called MPP+, which is recognized by dopaminergic neurons as dopamine. It looks enough like dopamine that the transporter for dopamine takes this compound up and loves it. To make matters worse, MPP+ anneals, it clings to neuromelanin like crazy. So if you've been exposed to it, it's not like it's there and then gone. It depots in neuromelanin and then slowly gets released to cause a state of chronic toxicity. Now it's kind of cool, and I'm pretty proud of the fact that we were able to show that astrocytes contain most of monoamine oxidase B, and they're the cells that make this transitional molecule that's so toxic. I mean, it's kind of a sad thing to pin a rap like this on the poor astrocyte, but guilty as charged, and this gives us insight. Now, I want to make one final point. MPP+, you see that big plus sign? Outside the blood-brain barrier, this can't get in. And it's not very toxic. I mean, if you take enough of it, of course, it's not good for you. But at these tiny doses necessary to produce this brain toxicity, it's not getting in at all. Oh, and one other kind of cool thing. Remember I told you that rodents didn't show any effect at all? That's because rodents, but not you, have got monoamine oxidase B in the blood-brain barrier, and as soon as MPTP tries to cross, it's converted to a polarized molecule and can't get in. All right, so this is kind of funny. About a month after Bill's article was published in Science, Aldrich Chemical Company had a run on MPTP. They were the only place that carried MPTP. It was considered a minor, almost a contaminant, but they had some. They sold it for $11 a gram. 6 months later, they sold a gram for $9,500. You talk about inflation? This is scientific inflation. This was the most desirable molecule in hundreds of labs all around the world. Aldrich was behind in their orders by a year. And by the way, the full impact of this had not yet registered with the chemists. So they were probably sloshing around in their tennis shoes, mixing this stuff up without a lot of precautions or gloves on or anything like that. And subsequently, I won't have time to talk about it, but people traced down some of these chemists that work with this, and they have Parkinson's disease that came on in their 30s and 40s. All right, so there was this stuff around, and check this out. This is funny. So Stan Burns was one of the people at the NIH that began studying MPTP very carefully, and he did a search, and what he discovered was that Gulf Chemical Company, the proud manufacturers of paraquat, had another compound that they thought would be another multi-million-dollar herbicide called, they had already, they tested some names, cyberquat. So they test marketed this, and cyberquat is nothing other than MPP plus. This molecule, which if it's in your brain at concentrations that are just, extremely small, it will devastate your dopaminergic neurons. Now the truth is, MPP plus will not cross the blood-brain barrier. It's toxic, and they ultimately decided not to market it for some financial reasons. But the irony of this is that on the back of a 10-pound bag of cyberquat, which if it were in the brains of people in toxic concentrations would make 100 million people Parkinsonian, on the back of this bag were instructions. This could be hazardous to your health. We recommend soda water and lime and 2 other ingredients, and then this will turn the compound back to something harmless called MPTP. Okay, the bright side, the good news is the animal model. We didn't have one. Now we got one. You can inject a little MPTP into the carotid artery of a monkey. It gets in, it destroys the dopaminergic neurons on that side of the brain, so you've got a normal nervous system on one side, Parkinsonian nervous system on the other. You can do both ways, whatever you want to do, test drugs, test pathogenesis. It put us on the trail of compounds in agrarian basins, areas where there's a lot of agriculture, where the incidence of Parkinson's disease is higher by sometimes a factor, depending on who you read, of 2 to 5 times what it would be otherwise. And who knows, it could be. There are thousands of compounds that look a little like MPTP. So, so here is a monkey beef. Here's a monkey, a squirrel monkey that's been given MPTP. Now, if you know anything about squirrel monkeys, especially those that have been forced to do things that they don't want to do, like join you in the laboratory, you're not going to mess with a squirrel monkey because one of your fingers is going to be gone when you pull your hand away. So you can see that this squirrel monkey is in no condition whatsoever to bite anyone's finger or do any harm at all. That's Bill Langston, that's Bill's hands in the picture here. So they gave this monkey some levodopa and some bromocriptine. Either would work. There's an earlier picture where Bill's hand comes in for a second, and this monkey makes a beeline for it, and he barely gets it out of the enclosure. But you can see it's an amazing animal model and something we didn't have. The contributions to our understanding of Parkinson's disease of this tragic story are immense. It's given us a way to study this, to test drugs, to consider ways that a very, very finite area of the brain can be irreversibly destroyed. So a couple of loose ends, last slide. What about those frozen addicts? So Toby Govia and the Sylvie brothers are sad cases. Toby was better on levodopa, as were the Sylvie brothers, but really they were unskilled. They didn't really have any other talents except those bad things that they used to do. Toby went home, struggled, wasn't getting along very well, so he decided to rob a bank. And he went in and he robbed the bank. Now, here's your bank robber. Give me all the money in the till, right? So the police came, and one of the tellers said, she said, he had a mask on, and he talked in a falsetto voice, but she said, it's got to be that guy standing out on the corner there, going like this. So, and they said, his name is Toby Govia. He lives only about 4 blocks from here. So when Toby finally got home, moving rather slowly, the police were waiting for him. So he was back in jail, and I've really lost contact with what's further happened. The Sylvie brothers were more like cat burglars. They would go to a place when they didn't think anyone was home and break in. Then they'd run like crazy and jump over a couple of fences, et cetera, to safety. So one day they were doing this, getting worse and worse on their medications with their Parkinson's disease, and they, Bill or Dave, they trying to get over this fence, and it was a picket fence, and it had kind of a sharp poker. And Bill, I think, got stuck on the picket fence. He could not get off. He just simply couldn't get off. It'd been a while since he had his levodopa, and he asked David to help him. Dave couldn't get him off. So the police found him 2 hours later, stuck on the picket fence, just completely helpless. So those folks went back to the Hooskow. Connie Saints has done reasonably well. And if you'll bear with me for 2 more minutes, I want to tell you just a couple of tiny things about the mad scientists that put all of this in motion. And you might have guessed that there had to be somebody behind the Northern California epidemic of MPTP toxicity. And the individual probably most likely to be responsible is someone by the name of Vincent Mason. Vincent Mason was a guy from Brownsville, Texas, who knocked around for a while and then went to law school. His parents moved to California. He moved up with them, and he looked around, and by accident he met somebody who was running a free clinic for poor people in the Bay Area. And this guy became very involved. He helped them with their legal work. He helped create a foundation for them, and was just doing great work. Then there was another very good thing that this guy did, and then suddenly things began to change. He must have bumped into some bad company, because he then met somebody, and this individual's goal was to make a beverage called Giggle. And this beverage was going to be a carbonated drink with some sugar in it, but the carbonation was nitrous oxide. So nitrous oxide was very popular about this time. And so this drink, they're going to put a cap on it. It was legal. Nitrous oxide was perfectly legal. And Giggle would be a giggle, right? You do this and you giggle a little bit and blah, blah, blah. So it turned out that there was an explosion where they were trying to build this little lab to do Giggle, so that put that out of business. And things were quiet for a while. And then he got a phone call from somebody who he had met through this Giggle adventure guy. And the guy said, I'm going to send somebody over, a chemist by the name of Carl. And Carl's going to, would you let Carl work in your house? We're going to pay you fabulous sums of money. Carl's going to be doing some stuff. He's making a new antihistamine. It's all hush-hush now, mind you. So this is Vincent telling the story years later. It's all hush-hush, but all they're doing is making an antihistamine, but we've got to keep it quiet. And we're going to pay you a lot of money. So Carl came. Carl was very twitchy, never had a last name as far as anyone could tell, and was busy making the most elaborate kind of chemical stuff. He had a real serious chemical background. And one day, didn't talk much, but this Vincent guy heard him yelling, and he said, "Oh my God, I've got it." And so they packaged some of this new antihistamine up, which of course was the new heroin, and started selling it in pretty big quantities. And probably some of the product was pure enough that there weren't any problems. But before you know it, you had Toby Govia and Juanita Lopez and all of these people, and probably dozens more who got exposed. Carl felt terrible, and he split. Now, up to this point, Vincent maintains that everything was fine, but his troubles were getting more and more severe financially, and he moved back down to Texas, because he bought a little house for his parents, but they liked to stay in California, and he got a bunch of chemists to come in, and they had a huge lab that was making PCP and trying to make the reverse methyl ester of Demerol. So we would never know about this, but some cops in Brownsville, Texas, made a blind call to Langston because they'd been reading the newspapers and hearing things, and they said, Langston, have you worked with this compound? And Langston said, what is this call about? and they said, well, we think this guy was living in the Bay Area and seems to know a lot about this, and they said, would you like to see him? And Langston said, like to see him? Yeah, I would, but why? Well, because he may be becoming Parkinsonian. So they shipped him up to Palo Alto, and Langston interviewed him very carefully, writes a very extended portion in this ghost-written book that came out called The Frozen Attics, talking about this guy. And to this day, Langston, who is a shrewd judge of human nature, and better than anyone I've ever seen can ferret out a lie or inconsistency, just simply doesn't know if the first part of this guy's story, which checks out, he did work for this nonprofit, he was considered a valuable asset, et cetera, but the idea that he would let someone make an antihistamine under those conditions sounds pretty far-fetched. So I am done. I want to show you a picture of Bill. This is Bill Langston. This is 1991, so it's a decade, or not quite, after all this happened. Here is Juanita Lopez. She went to Sweden as her Parkinson's disease got worse and worse and worse and worse. She went to Sweden and had a fetal tissue transplant. And if you know anything about the history of the fetal tissue transplant, you know that some people respond pretty well. And she happens to be one of them. She got a dramatic improvement. She needed far less levodopa. She'd been on grams of levodopa. I think some of these patients were getting 3 to 5 grams of levodopa in addition to carbidopa. Well, that's it, folks. Thank you very much for your indulgence. Keep Louis Pasteur in your mind. It's not enough just to see the thing that could lead to something terribly interesting. And by the way, if I were to interview every single one of you, and you gave me a little time, I would discover at least 1 or 2 things that you've stumbled on. It may not be the magnitude of MPTP, but it gave you a good run. You know, somebody with a strange presentation of a condition that has almost never a presentation like that, and you had the gumption and the dedication to follow up on that. But I would also find instances where you, in retrospect, say, oh my gosh, I blew it. If I had just gotten that bindle from those cops in Salinas, I could be on television. So good luck to all of you, and be prepared. So I'm happy to consider any questions if there are some, or comments, or not. Yes, Tom, please.
In his science paper, did Langston reference the 1979 Journal of Psychiatric Research paper?
I believe he did. I'd have to go back and look, but I think he's pretty meticulous about stuff like that. Now, if I can extend your question a little bit, because I think it probes at how completely open and forthright someone might be about a discovery of this magnitude. And I would simply say that his book is filled with minor inaccuracies. He really takes me to task, even though we published together. And he couldn't have done some of the things that he did without my help. But he claims that I was his student, as if I was just an acolyte in his great collection of folks. And he says, these guys over at Stanford, because he's down at the county hospital, blew it. They treated Connie Saints very badly. And how could they have made that film? Drug-induced Parkinsonism, indeed. How foolish of them. He also fails to mention that Rusty and I had Toby on levodopa way before Langston even dreamt that might be a possibility. So I could go on in that vein. This keeps the spotlight where, as far as Langston's concerned, it properly belongs, directly on him. Then I bid you all adieu, and